Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Frampton Unplugged, the future of everything. Thank you to the 130 of you that have already subscribed, much appreciated, and thank you to all of those who've given feedback, taken all of it on board. The first episode I think was a tad too long, so thank you for that feedback. Ongoing they will be shorter, sharper and focus more on one theme, and in future episodes hopefully we'll bring in some kind of more motion and different shots so it isn't all you looking straight at me. So this episode today is going to be about trust and the changing dynamic of trust. I've taken two kind of things that have happened in the last couple of weeks. Firstly, Edelman, which is the corporate comms business, brought out its Trust Barometer, which is an annual survey, and that gave us some very interesting insight into how people and consumers kind of think about trust and organisations and people. And secondly, Mr. Zuckerberg finally, after 6 months, decided to come out with a statement around how Facebook was going to take responsibility for fake news and for Russian kind of bots, or at least kind of put something out that started to kind of get close to dealing with that issue. So I'm going to talk about both of those things for a second. So firstly, let's talk about the Edelman Trust Barometer. So interestingly, for the first time in 10 years, the trust in journalism and traditional media jumped up, and it actually jumped up by 5 percentage points. Conversely, trust in platforms actually dropped by 2%, so in the likes of Facebook and Twitter. Now, perhaps not that surprising given a lot of the bad press that we've seen around the travelling of fake news, the intervention of kind of Russian bots and potentially other kind of bad forces in politics and the election results both stateside and in Brexit. But it's a really interesting kind of to see that the trust in media organisations has suddenly kind of taken a jump, and that can only be a good thing because there's a lot of debate around the way that content is pushed around on things like Facebook. So then Facebook came out last week. Zuckerberg came out on his own platform, which he broadcast his view of how Facebook would kind of deal with trust. And rather kind of interestingly broke trust down to two very simple questions. The first was, do you recognise this news source? And the second was, how trustworthy is this news source? So that is the be-all and end-all, of Facebook's way of measuring trust on the web. Now, you could argue that that's taking the wisdom of crowds and using technology to decide what is trustworthy, but I think most people would say that that can easily be gamed. The vast majority of people can't necessarily say what is a trusted source beyond kind of some of the obvious trusted sources like the BBC or the FT. In fact, the Edelman Trust Barometer told us that 60% of people actually are unable to identify whether they think a news source is trustworthy. So how can two very simple questions on Facebook be enough to decide whether an organisation is trustworthy and therefore that content should be promoted around the Facebook ecosystem? So to me, I think it's a pretty lame response from Facebook. I don't think it goes far enough. And when you think about all of the potential regulation that could happen on these platforms with Logan Paul and YouTube, with Twitter and kind of fake handles, etc., etc. I think a lot of these platforms are facing kind of a real genuine kind of fear of regulation, and Zuckerberg's response was probably tipping the hat to Washington to suggest that they're doing something at least to cater for the kind of concern around how news travels around Facebook. So trust in an organisation also has another dimension, which is obviously trust in the leader themselves, the CEO or the founder. And in which case, based on Facebook, Zuckerberg came out and broadcast to the Facebook community his decision around how the platform would measure trust. But that's something that he does in a very old-fashioned way. He broadcasts. He's not on the platform every day interjecting and conversing with his community. The same is also true of Jack Dorsey. Rarely does he go on Twitter, although it's slightly more often these days, and has a conversation with his own community base. So begs the question, if these leaders created these platforms to help improve the connections and the conversations of people worldwide, then why do they not use their platforms themselves? Interestingly, we also heard last week that Tim Cook came out and said that he actually suggests that his nephew should only use his iPhone irregularly, and they should have time away from his iPhone. So again, you've got the same issue. The founder of a business, whether it's tech or platform, that creates kind of almost this addictive kind of regular frequency. You have the founders that actually veer away from doing that themselves. So why is that? So it was an interesting piece written by a Guardian journalist last week who talked about the fact that he felt that it was almost kind of the next wave of exploiting human psychology. He talked about dopamine hits, which is the kind of chemical reaction you get when you get a notification, when you get a kind of short-term high. So almost starts to get you to think about, actually, is Facebook, is Google, is YouTube, is Twitter almost the new soft drinks company at best? At worst, possibly the new tobacco company. It's the new addiction. And if you start to look at these companies in that light, is their purpose, so the purpose to connect people, to kind of unveil the world's kind of information for everyone to receive, is that purpose really true, or is it actually in pursuit of pure profit? And there you start to think about the corporation of yesterday received a lot of criticism. Arguably today's biggest corporates, which is all of the tech businesses that sit at the top of the tree, arguably they're more exploitative of human behaviour, of human psychology and data. So we're at a really interesting kind of point where regulation and how these platforms are kind of being thought about, as the Edelman barometer shows, is really starting to register with people, and people are starting to think about it, think about what they consume, what they see on there, and not just a place for pictures, but it's a place where kind of opinion is formed. And they're starting to think about, do I trust this? So I think it's a really interesting time, and what happens in the next 6 to 12 months will be very telling. So if businesses want to continue to be trusted, then their leaders, in my opinion, need to not hide away. They need to be accessible, they need to be authentic, they need to even be vulnerable. And there are not too many great examples out there, if I'm honest. I think if you look to Unilever, you've obviously got Paul Polman, who's an exceptional example. You have John Legere from T-Mobile, and to even a lesser extent, you at least have kind of the president of the US that is on Twitter and responding and kind of conversing with people. You can argue that you don't necessarily agree with his perspectives, but he puts himself out there and uses kind of social as a modern platform for communication. How many CEOs actually do that today? We've just talked about the fact that even the CEOs and founders of the businesses that run those platforms don't do that. But I'm a firm believer that tomorrow's kind of leader will have to kind of live in social. They'll have to be authentic. They'll have to want to have conversations, so respond to their customers in new ways. And it's almost like the internet, the promise of the internet was this transparent place where kind of communities would be able to converse openly and freely and democratically. But in actual fact now those communities are being kind of exploited for margin, whether that's harvesting of data. We're seeing content shared that's arguably more clickbait than quality content that helps shape opinion. And we're also seeing kind of businesses that are now all powerful, that even a government kind of struggles to regulate. So we're almost in need of the next generation of web platforms, in my opinion, new communities that can actually bring transparency and can bring the kind of point of the web back to life, allowing people to make a difference through platforms and community. And one last kind of recommendation I have for you, if you don't subscribe to it, is Masters of Scale podcast. It's a great listen, and actually the recent one just last week was all around the topic of social communities, and the original founder, Katerina of Flickr, talked about how you have to make sure that you set the rules for a community very early on. And now look at the communities like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. They're kind of out of control and their founders can't do anything about it. So it won't surprise you to hear that I'm a firm believer in social leadership. So here's a few tips from me. Be prolific, write a lot, tweet a lot, kind of post a lot on LinkedIn, put your perspectives out there, but ask other people for their opinions so that it becomes a conversation rather than a broadcast. Think about how to be authentic, how to join other people's conversations and share other people's conversations, not just your own. And think about how you're always going to be constantly learning within the social space. Think about how you can share and help other people, because after all, it's a community. So they're just a few things that I think anybody can kind of pick up and think about from a social leadership perspective. So that's it for today. Thank you again for coming and watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. For some of the articles that I mentioned, I'll make sure that I put them in the description below, so you can go and find out more information. And I look forward to talking to you next time.